This video is all about textures. I did one of these a few months back that I'll link to in the description below, but I've been getting a lot of requests for fur and leaves and metal and cloth and all the things basically that I put into this video here. I'm David Finch. I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years. If you enjoy this video, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. All right, so for our first texture, we're going to work on some fur. This is something that I've had requested quite a bit lately. You guys have been asking for this one. And so I'm going to draw the back of an animal. This would be kind of my form right here. Maybe a leg coming out here, rib cage, and it's going to have fur all along the back. I'm just going to draw in just the profile outline of my shape. And I'm drawing a line, connecting a few lines under and then bringing them up. And it looks like I've got hair. It's kind of going in a couple of different directions. I don't want it to all evenly, completely flow. Hair tends to clump, so I get peaks as opposed to hair. And I can draw hair just flying out like this. But generally speaking, I find with fur, it comes out in fairly even clumps, just like this. And so I draw it in triangular shapes. And I'm just getting a bit of a rough in of where I want all my fur to go. And I can start to finish it out with line weights as I go along. I'm gonna have a bit of a shadow coming through here. Start to run some fur up from that and around this form. I find with animals, I really like drawing a lot of very detailed anatomy, but when there's enough fur, that can actually start to really get covered by the fur, so you really don't see it so much. And so I draw broader forms. I'll shadow under here too. This will be under the rib cage. Maybe define in a couple of ribs. Bit of a shadow for some of the muscles of the back. And I don't need to be very specific with it because I really do want this to look like it's very much covered in fur, and too much detail with my shadowing starts to look a little odd if the fur is very thick. And so I'm still roughing in, and you can see I've got most of my fur basically defined in where I'm going to put it. And so from here, I'm going to go ahead and just start to finish this out with line weights. And it's a lot of negative space drawing. It's very helpful for me to know where my shapes are. All these little shapes, I can put a little bit of corner of shadow under this, just a little under here. And it's a bit of a push and pull between my rendering that I like to pull out this way and then making sure that it's coming to peaks. And I don't want to start rendering hard and then go out. I really need it to fade both this way and this way, because I have it fading into the overall body, but then I want it to come out to peaks that thin out also. And the thicker and heavier that I put these shadows, the more it kind of turns the form as it goes around. It's fairly simple doing this. Fur is definitely something you really don't have to overthink a huge amount. Just like every texture, they're all pretty simple kind of once you get the hang of it. And a huge part of it is just getting enough finished that you can kind of see where your shadow patterning and your dark to light is forming up, and then just shoring things up to accentuate that. So I want it darker as it rounds out toward here, and I want to round this form around. And so as I get enough in, I can see where to put more detail and where to make it darker, and then where to leave it a little bit more open so I can get that rounding. I kind of want the fur to go in this sort of a shape. So rounding here and then coming up to a peak at, I guess this would be kind of the elbow. I'm going to darken it here, and it's going to really round toward light in the center. And with fur, or a lot of these kinds of textures, we're going to do some other ones in just a minute. And they tend to be, for me, a bit of a push and pull of detail, I can get a little messy and a little sketchy, and then I just bring it together using extra detail. So it's very difficult for me to worry about here's a specific shape. I'm going to completely finish this shape out. What I do is I'll just start to throw in a shape and then define it with shapes around it. So I drew a line here, I'm connecting up through here. It's just kind of connecting things, getting that overall kind of flow. I'm really just using the light lines that I defined earlier to give me a framework to start putting my line weights, little shadows, hints of shadow. And you'll find as you do this, you start to get into a bit of a rhythm, and it becomes a very mindless, simple task to get this working. In a lot of ways, this is the kind of art that I'll end up doing if I'm stuck on the phone for too long. And I've kind of got a little lost here, so I'm going to shore this up. And I want to make sure that when this is being inked, that it's very clear kind of where I'm going with all my shadow shapes, and I don't leave anything too loose. And that's a little bit harsh looking, but that's all right because it's something I can just now round through. I find this is one of the hardest things of doing any kind of a texture for me, is especially if you're not as familiar with the texture, this is something you're working with, and you haven't really done it before, when you put down a few lines, it doesn't feel like anything yet, and it can be a little bit disorienting. So you really have to kind of allow yourself to go through and finish enough of it that it has a flow, and then you get a sense of how it's going to look over the whole picture. And it takes establishing enough of it for it to start to have an overall feeling. That's basically it for fur. I can see as I'm looking through it where I've got it lighter here, kind of lighter down the center of this, and then shadowed along the bottom. I had some ribs kind of defined a little bit, and you can see that I really kind of lost that. And that's just with thicker fur, you're really not going to see much of that. And so I'm not really too worried about the fact that that kind of got a little lost. That's really actually the effect that I want. And just getting those shadows even just slightly defined in there, it still helps me kind of round the form overall and get an overall feeling of connected fur. So from here, we're going to go ahead and start to draw some leaves. And this is something I've had requested quite a bit also. And the way that I like to draw my leaves is I do basically a 3-leaf kind of a pattern. So I can draw a small leaf, a larger leaf in the center, and then another small leaf, and this one might be a little broken off, fix that I guess. And I just take this pattern and just start to layer it together as I go through. Leaves that I want to be in the foreground, I make a little larger, and I can just start layering some leaves behind. Here's another 3-leaf pattern pointing upward. I'll draw a nice big one down here, gonna be very close to us. It's very easy with leaves to draw a leaf, a leaf, a leaf, a leaf, and just draw the same size and shape of a leaf, and that's fine, but it starts to look a little bit static. And the nice thing about drawing leaves in this kind of a formation is you get generally, and what I like to do is I go with a larger leaf and then some smaller leaves, and that really kind of breaks up my sizing, and it also creates nice little clumps, like even little clumps. This is something that I got from looking at P. Craig Russell. Mike Mignola is very good at doing these sorts of leaves. So there's some artists that do this very, very well. I wanted to finish this out, so I just put another leaf into my 3-leaf pattern. So I guess it's a 4-leaf here, maybe 5. There we go. If you really want to do something that's very design oriented, and I see Mike Mignola do this, he'll always stick with this 3-leaf pattern, and it looks absolutely beautiful, and it reads like a bit of a pattern also. I like mine to look a little bit more organic, and so I don't marry myself completely to doing just a 3-leaf pattern. If something else is going to work, I'll do it. Just going around different angles, connecting them together. And I don't like to do a leaf in a perfect leaf shape either. I just find it a little bit more interesting to go ahead and get a bit more of a character to that line, give it some nice hooks and a bit more of a jagged sort of a shape. And I'm just kind of changing up my sizing. I also have a bit of a pattern where I'm kind of coming through the whole shot like this. Just connecting these through all the way through the picture. And really it's just the same thing over and over again, but drawing a larger leaf and smaller leaves kind of around it in these little mini patterns all the way through gives it a nice feeling of kind of a visual bounce and gives it an organic feel without having to overthink it at all. And that's going to be my rough in for my leaves. And from here, I'll just go ahead and start to put in some line weights and some shadowing, and it'll fill it out into a nice pattern of finished leaves. And so just on the undersides of some of my leaves, especially this one here, is quite a bit closer. So I want the line on it to be thicker. This is my center of the leaf. So make that a little thicker. Kind of curves under here. I don't want to go too thick on the portion that's pointing up. I can also put some veining on the leaves too, just like this. I want a nice bouncy kind of a organic looking line. So just a line, hook, line, that kind of a thing. I can connect some of them together, and I'm rounding around. This is an overall form that rounds like this. So I'm bearing that in mind when I'm drawing my patterns on top, just very, very simply. I'm a little lost here. Quite sure what I was doing there, so let me finish that. I think I started with some leaf shapes and forgot what I was doing. And very often when I'm doing this, I've got a line weight under my larger leaf that's closer to us. I didn't go incredibly thick with it, but as I finish out the rest of these, I might end up having to go back and kind of restate that and make it a little thicker, just so it pops closer than this leaf, for instance. I don't want everything to have the same line weight underneath it. But I also don't want to draw an incredibly thick line on something in the foreground and then be kind of stuck with it. I can always erase it, of course, but I prefer to kind of build my thicknesses so it all works in relation to itself. I want the whole picture to have a consistent thickening of line as it gets closer and thinner as it gets further out. But just going through and just drawing a bit of a thicker line on the undersides and underside curves goes a very, very long way to kind of bringing this to life. And this right here, I find I've had artists help with backgrounds at times, and my biggest challenge is just trying to instill the patience to be able to go through and line weight things properly, because it really makes such an incredible difference when an entire picture is done. And if I just left it like this, it's fine, but it looks very flat and unrealistic. Just this bit of extra time just going through is very, very worth it. And it can be a little bit difficult to have the patience to do that for something that is a background element. But I really feel like a reader, honestly, doesn't really even consciously look at. When they look at your art, they look at the figures, they look at the faces and the anatomy and the expressions, and they don't see background elements like this at all. But when they're done well, it lends a believability that is, I think, essential for immersing someone in your comic book, in your story. It is the kind of thing that really makes the difference between mediocre and, stronger comic art. And it's also, I have found, very, very worth your time, because if you're willing to take a little bit of extra time and spend longer on your pages and really detail these things out nicely and make them as good as you can make them, you will reap the benefit. It makes it easier to get work. People are more excited to work with an artist that can bring their story to life than someone who just wants to do cool action poses. So it's getting there. Got more line weights and detail to finish. I've got a few tangents with my leaves here and there, like right here, this leaf kind of tangented. So I tried to bring that shape out over this shape a little bit. I don't worry about it too much. It's leaves, and no one leaf really needs to be utterly and completely clear over another leaf. But the more you can avoid lines flowing into each other, you're always going to be a little better off. I've got it mostly pretty well finished now, and now it's just a matter of kind of going through and seeing where it needs a little bit extra detail. Like this leaf here needs just a little bit more. The kind of visual flow that I want, if you detail too much, everything just kind of closes into a big blob. And I do it so often that I feel very unqualified to tell you how to not do that. I have a real tendency. We're almost finished with this, and then we'll move into the last stage, and that's just going to be shadowing out some of the leaves that I have in the background behind some other leaves, and that really helps pop it. And this is a choice that you can make too. If you have a lot of shadowing in the foreground and you want this to separate back and push back, then you don't want to add shadow to it because it can start to conflict with your foreground or other elements in the panel. Because this is the only element I have here, I feel pretty comfortable going ahead and doing it. So we'll do that in just a minute. And so I'm going to start to draw in some shadow areas behind. I'll make this one dark, shadow under this leaf here. I'm just kind of blocking in some shadow on some of the leaves that are behind some of my foreground leaves. I can even just draw in some extra back there, even with my sizing there. And so it's just adding some shadowed leaf shapes where I feel like it'll work. Like maybe under this leaf here, I'll just add another shape. I've already got one here. I'll just draw that in dark. And I'm really trying to think in terms of what is going to pop my shapes. And all of these shadows really are intended to push the light parts forward and just give it a little more dimensionality. Make this just a little thicker. That kind of brings it well forward. Something I knew I was going to do this whole time, really. I just kind of waited just to be sure how thick I wanted it, and I think it's going to work. All right, for our next example, we're going to draw some metal. And to start, I'm just going to draw 2 tubes. Very, very slight perspective. Actually, we'll draw 3 tubes. I think that might describe it just a little bit better. And then we'll draw some proper metal below. But just to give you an idea of what I'm thinking. So now I'm lighting this, all of them from the same angle. So this side of the tube would be dark. And now if this were shiny, because and my light, by the way, is coming in at an angle from the front, so it's not directly to the side. If this is a more reflective surface, then you would more clearly see where the light's coming from. So it'd be more like this. And this is the effect that you'll get from like a shiny fabric or leather or that kind of thing. Something a little bit more like that and make it a little bit more clear. And so you'd see directly where the light's hitting, as opposed to more of a soft light that just shows the shadow and is light all the way to this side. And now for metal, we have this same effect. And so I'm going to draw my line for this side of the shadow, and I'm going to draw my line here. So this is where my main light is hitting. But then with metal, you have something called the Fresnel effect. I apologize. It really doesn't matter. And there's this whole theory behind this, and I watched this video. It was fascinating. The entire theory behind why the sides of something that's very reflective are extra reflective, and it can be very bright around the outsides of something. Ultimately, it really doesn't matter. All you need to know is that you end up with light coming around the outsides of a very reflective surface. We're going to draw some metal, and for this, I'll draw an arm. So I'm going to just very loosely put in shadow, and I'm going to light it the same way that I did my 3 tubes. And I'm going to do this very light because I'm going to have to erase this when we work in some metallic texture. All right, so here I've got some shadow just drawn in very, very lightly, just to get a sense of where we're going to put our shadow. Now I've got my shadow drawn all the way to the edges of my forms, and everything is done like this first example here. And now I'm just going to lighten this down, and we're going to do this as metal as opposed to regular shadow. And it's very easy. What I want to do is define along the edges of where my shadow was and just open up. And so I have a reflectivity here away from the shadow, and so this part will be open. And I can actually cast a shadow from it. So you'll see it open there and then casting a shadow onto the surface below it. Now I'm defining along the shadow, along the bicep, and I'm just making sure to keep my line fairly jagged and quickly thrown. If you really work your line in slowly, it can kind of kill that effect, but a nice flowing quick line really looks like light or shadowing or detail across a metal surface. Now I'm going to shadow underneath that, so I've got a bit of light, underlight here, shadow over the muscle underneath, and then this is going to also pick up some light. It connects, this will be shadowed. I'm just creating this effect all the way down the arm. I can go across the chest, and this is where I had my shadow defined, so I'm just drawing a line through some nice quick lines kind of connecting, and this just looks like shadow detail or detail from the background around just streaked across your form. You can see in real life, you can see quite a bit of detail in the shadowing on these sorts of hyper reflected surfaces, but that's not really something that's very translatable for illustration. So I just like to use my shadow placement and then just draw nice lines with a little bit of character, connect another little line to it, and I'm just creating the illusion of streaked detail on my metal, reflected detail. That's really all there is to it. Kind of butted up against the edge of my panel here, something I don't like to do, but and so it's just really the same kind of line quality all the way through. That little pocket of light looks like it's reflected from below. I'm going to do the same thing here. This is where I had the shadow for my stomach. And so here's just my simple line streak down through. I can draw, now I've got a bit of reflectivity from below here, and then below that, I'll draw a cast shadow onto the muscle below. I can do the same thing again. I'll cast a shadow from this muscle onto this one, but then I get the reflectivity off to the side here, kind of my Fresnel effect going on just right over here. That's really all there is to it. It's actually a very simple thing to pull off. It's using the same shadowing, but just making sure that your outlines are all lit. The outlines of your forms are lit, so you don't draw your shadow all the way through to the edge of the form everywhere. So you never connect your shadow to the outside. And I did a little bit here. Let's actually fix that. I think that'll be a little bit better, just like that. And actually just that little bit of change, I think, helped my picture a little bit. And I can go up through it and draw a little bit of detail. I can even, if I want this to seem a little bit darker, this is a reflected light from the side of the form coming up here. I can give it a little detail. I can do the same thing here. But it really doesn't need much. It really doesn't need any at all. It's just something that you can add to it if you want. I also, if I want to increase the size of the shadow here and give it a little bit of character, I can kind of come across it just like this, just very lightly. Just bring out some more reflections on the surface. This is my reflection from below, but here, this is where the entire form is casting a shadow onto the surface below, so I'm going to make that dark. Here also. So it's really a very, very simple effect. Here's my kind of rounded shape, give it a little line weight. And then instead of just drawing a shadow all the way through, I'm going to draw the edge of that shadow and then give my line a little bit of character. I want a bit of a thicker core, and then I can go thinner with some of the lines around it. If you have a nice sharp pencil and you just pull your line or push your line very quickly, you get a nicer effect than if you really go slowly. And then I'll give it maybe a bit of a reflection up here, and then just going through on the other side. And that's really all there is to getting a metallic effect on a rounded surface. And then I'm going through, and I felt like I got a little messy in there, so I'm just cleaning it up a little bit. I think that looks a little better. That's going to do it. Now For our last effect, we're going to draw some torn cloth, and I'm going to draw it just flat against the page because we're not really working with folds right now. So I don't want to do like the folds on an arm because it'll start to confuse things just a little bit. So just to isolate our torn cloth, what I'm going to do is just sketch in some tearing for the bottom of the cloth. And so I've just got kind of circles connected together just to give me a nice kind of a design. And I want to say also, when you're doing this, my rule really always is draw a large form, something medium, and then something small. And if you do that, just like with our leaves earlier on, you'll always end up with something that over a whole page can look very, very organic. Really just a simple system of large, a little smaller, and then smallest. Put those together. You can go much larger, and then my medium might be about that big and my small here, but it really gives you something that's very organic looking, very simply and easily. And I'm doing that here at the bottom now. I have to erase all this. But I want to make sure you know what I'm thinking when I'm drawing these shapes. And I kind of do this automatically because I've been doing this for so many years. But if you have not really been doing this for years, and I'm assuming for most of you, you haven't, it's something you really have to be aware of and consciously think larger shape, smaller, and then smaller shape, and then connect them all together. And so I've got the edge of some torn fabric here. I'm going to lighten this down again, and then we'll start to draw in a finished drawing of this, finished cartoon. And I want a nice kind of a jagged kind of a line. And this is something that you'll find just gets easier to do as you go along. It certainly was for me. I struggled with this mightily. I remember watching Mark Silvestri, who really taught me years ago, do this kind of thing. And he still does it much nicer than I can. He just has such a natural feel for it, but I've gotten a lot better at it. And it really is a matter of just getting enough of a feel for it that you can kind of relax. I don't really like that shape up here. I think I'm gonna just put another one here, another one here. And so I've got a larger, smaller, and a little smaller, and I think that's gonna work compositionally a little nicer. So now what I wanna do is, I've got a hole here, and so I'm gonna draw a flap where that's opened up. And so this is the fabric that's just fallen, and there it is. And I can draw a little bit of a flapping on the top, but not too much. Here's a flap here. And I'm just gonna kind of layer this just a little bit. Here, I'll do the same thing. Here's a flap hole there for that hole. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna draw shadows inside my holes that I've created in the fabric. So here's one, here's another one here. This is very, very simple. There's another hole here. I've got my fabric opened up here. Draw another kind of a shape here. It's looking just a little empty. All right, and so now I'm gonna fill out the rest of this here. And so I'm just casting a shadow from all these shapes onto the surface below. And now, because I have a flap here, here, and here, I want to shadow underneath that too, because that'll be casting shadow onto the cloth below it. Got a bit of a flap here, cast a shadow there, create another one here. And I want it to look not like the cloth is all just sitting flat. Now, let me just go ahead and finish out some line weights. I'm going to go ahead and differentiate my surface by rendering the wall behind upwards like this. And obviously this isn't necessary. This is really the wall behind the fabric, but I really like differentiating my two surfaces visually. And rendering along the wall just pushes it back from the fabric that's in front of it. I need to be nice and consistent with my line weight or thickness and my direction and my spacing. And it'll give me a nice textured effect. And now I'm going to go ahead and just start to give some directionality to some of my cloth just using rendering. Because it's going to pull from points where it's torn, I'll just draw some lines around just to give it some sense of that pull. I'm keeping these fairly light. I don't want it to conflict really with what I have below. And none of this is necessary. Really, just the shapes themselves, the shadowing with the shapes is enough to give you that illusion. It's just kind of taking another step. I'm creating, you can see I've got a ridge here that I've created around this shape here. I'm going to do another one kind of here. And I'm just using rendering very lightly. And I want this to look like very dirty cloth. And so I'm going to, because I've got a ridge here, I want this to divot in. So I'm just curving the other way through here. And that pushes that inward. I need to be very aware of my overall patterning of where I'm raising and lowering the surface using these lines, or it can end up being a bit of a mess very quickly, but it's pretty easy to keep that kind of straight in your head. And I love these kinds of lines on capes like Moon Knight. It makes it look a little dirty and a little more rugged and weather worn, and it also gives a lot of directionality and volume to my shapes. And that's really it. And so I've added some detail and some kind of messy line to it and brought it a little bit further, but the essential technique for it is very, very simple. I've got a hole, I've shadowed underneath where it's casting a shadow. I've got a flap of fabric here that's casting a shadow. And I'm making sure to use larger and smaller shapes in conjunction with each other to give it a nice organic effect. The rest of these lines are here just to give the fabric some flow, push it in and pull it out and make it a little more interesting. Especially I want to do that without really rendering very, very clean fabric. So I'm just using very bouncy, jagged lines, very similar to what I did for the metal effect. I'm really not using something that is quite so, the metal effect is much more parallel, whereas these kinds of lines can bounce around quite a bit more. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to tune in Monday nights at 8 o'clock for our Monday Night Draw live stream, and I will see you in the next video.